want to know firstly how you came to be on this journey communicating this message.
Well, it began for me with Watergate. It began with the Watergate investigations into President Nixon and his use of intelligence agencies to spy on the American people and other things that he was involved with. So I began to see some of the same names turning up in the Watergate investigation that had been involved in things like the Kennedy assassination or the Bay of Pigs invasion or a number of other political events in American history. Some of the same people kept cropping up. So I asked myself, well, what do all these people have in common? What is their common origin? I began to notice the involvement of various religious groups and quasi-religious groups or secret societies in some cases involved peripherally in this. One of the major players in Watergate was a man called E. Howard Hunt. And Howard Hunt was a former CIA officer who was also the author of a lot of novels, some of which were occult novels. And Howard Hunt lived on a place called Witch's Island. And he wrote about cults and secret societies. And I began to wonder why, what's his relationship? His relationship to Gordon Liddy, for instance. Gordon Liddy was an FBI agent, whereas Hunt was CIA. But Gordon Liddy, one of his claims to fame was that he spied on Timothy Leary, the famous man who brought us LSD, turn on, tune in, and drop out. So all of this started to create this kind of nuclear fission in my mind, and I was trying to figure out relationships, connections, what did all of this mean? And it led me eventually to the occult. But it also led me to, it led me to a study of the Nazi Party also. As a chapter in a book I was going to write, I wanted to show how the Nazi Party was not really a political party the way we understand it, but that it was a cult. And I wound up at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And an archivist there, Dr. Robert Wolf, who ran that operation, introduced me to a whole cache of weapons, a whole cache of documents that were basically weapons, SS documentation concerning an organization I had never heard of before, called the Ahnenerbe. And this group, run by Himmler as part of Himmler's personal staff, was engaged in occult research. Now, I had heard rumors like this. I had read Morning of the Magicians, like everyone else. I had read The Spear of Destiny. But none of these books were documented very well. There were no source material. It was a lot of speculation. But here I was in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., looking at microfilm records of the Nazis' own documentation concerning their occult research. And that stunned me. It stunned me that it existed, and it stunned me that no one else had decided to look at this material or had talked about it. So based on that, I started to write what became Unholy Alliance, which was a study of the Nazi Party's involvement with the occult since the origins of the Nazi Party back in 1918 and 1919. So I was, again, astonished to find out there is a great deal of documentation about this, but that mainstream historians have simply not covered it. They've left it to fringe or alternative historians. And in a way, it's a little unfair because we don't need to speculate about this anymore. The documentation is extensive. So that led me to think, well, if the Nazis were involved in this, if the Nazis had occult connections and occult beliefs and an occult ideology, what about the United States? What occult underpinnings might there be in the United States? What secret societies perhaps might be working or afoot in our country? I mean, after all, Germany was considered the most materialistic, most pragmatic, most developed, most sophisticated country in Europe. It gave us Goethe and Beethoven and Wagner and, Nietzsche and all of this. Great philosophers and great authors, great poets, great artists and musicians. If it could happen there, why not in the United States, which was striving to be as materialistic and as scientific as Germany? Why wouldn't we have a similar situation in the United States? And, of course, my research led me to discover exactly that. There was definitely a connection there. There was definitely a kind of ideological current that ran parallel to that of the Nazi Party. And that's how Sinister Forces was born.
To what extent would that tie into modern-day ufology?
Well, in a great way. As we'll learn in the presentation of Secret Space Science, my focus is on the origins of that program. And the UFO connection goes back really to the beginning. There was belief that the Foo Fighters of World War II, which were bizarre flying objects that Allied forces saw over Europe, that there was evidence of a secret Nazi weapon that they had been developing, a kind of flying saucer that they were inventing back in the 1930s and 1940s. The Nazis had made tremendous strides in developing new forms of aircraft. We know, of course, about the V-1 and V-2 bombs, but there were other types of aircraft that they had invented as well, the swept wing aircraft for jet aircraft, for instance, and a lot of other technology like that. So there was a possible connection to UFOs from that angle. But there's also another connection, and that goes back to the Maury Island affair of 1947, the Kenneth Arnold sightings of UFOs, which gave us the term flying saucer back in June of 1947. A connection directly from there to the Nazi paperclip scientists that were brought over at the end of World War II to the United States to jumpstart our own space program, which was essentially, most people forget, was a military program. The space program was not a civilian program to investigate space, outer space, not in its original incarnation. It did not become a civilian program until 1957. But in the 1940s, this was a military operation run by the Department of the Army. The Nazi scientists were working for the Pentagon. They were working for the military. In contradiction to orders passed by President Truman at the time that no Nazi scientists were to be brought to the United States, that no Nazi scientists were to be offered jobs. He forbade it, and the Pentagon ignored him. The military just ignored him and brought over not only dozens of Nazi scientists, and not hundreds, but thousands of Nazi scientists to the United States. And that's not even talking about the Gehlen organization, which basically was the CIA's Western European intelligence operation, which was formed of former Nazi intelligence officers. So we had tremendous influence in the development of our CIA, in the development of NASA, in the development of our scientific and industrial apparatus in the 1940s and 1950s. The influence was heavily coming from the Nazis, from Nazi scientists, Nazi intelligence agents, Nazi philosophers, Nazi medical officers. Suddenly our country had, in a sense, sold its soul to the devil in order for us to gain a certain measure of security against the Russians. At the time, was our biggest fear was that the Soviet Union would become a world power, military power. And we were so frightened of that that we decided we would use the Nazis, regardless of their background, regardless of what atrocities they had committed. We would use them in furtherance of our own ends. The ends justify the means. And I think that this is the point at which America was at the verge of becoming something better than it was, and decided that maybe we would make these deals, we would cut these deals for the sake of security, and endanger our spiritual survival while we were guaranteeing our physical survival. It was a very tough decision to be made in the Cold War, and those of us who grew up in the Cold War remember the fear that was being inculcated in us as children. I was one of those people who had to duck under my school desk in air raid drills in case there was going to be an atomic bomb attack on the United States. We had to learn how to protect ourselves, and that was basically hiding under a desk. But we were told this was how we were going to survive. We were told that we were in imminent danger of being bombed by the Russians, and even by the Chinese, which was laughable then, and it's still laughable today. But anyway, we were taught that the Chinese would come from the West Coast, and the Russians would come from the East Coast, and we'd all be obliterated in some kind of thermonuclear war. So this is the kind of fear that we grew up with, and which legitimized the use of Nazi scientists, because the Nazis hated the communists as much as we did. That was the story we heard. And therefore the Nazis would help us against the Soviet Union. But if we just stop and think for a second, and I was there at the time when this happened, in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite, people had to stop and wonder, how is it that the Soviets beat the United States in the space race at that point, when we had all the best and the brightest working for us? We had Wernher von Braun, We had Walter Dornberger. We had Hubertus Sturkhold. We had a whole list of Nazis that we'll discuss in the presentation that worked for our side, that were supposed to be the cream of the crop, the people who ran Peenemünde, who ran Nordhausen, who ran all of the Nazi rocket factories, working for us on our side. How come we weren't able to launch a Sputnik of our own? There is evidence that we were being sabotaged by the very people we brought over, and that the Nazi scientists that we had in the United States were communicating secretly with Nazi scientists in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. We know for a fact that Wernher von Braun was sending classified documents to Nazi scientists back in Europe. We know this now. Declassified documents reveal it. We know that Wernher von Braun, as an example, was a devoted SS officer. I mean, this is something we were never told in the United States when Paperclip was running and when NASA was started and when everybody was so euphoric over the landing on the moon and Wernher von Braun taking all the credit for it. We never really knew the extent to which he was a committed, devoted Nazi. An SS officer since the 1930s. This was a man who was a committed believer. You could not belong to the SS as you would belong to the Rotary Club or something like that, you know. The SS was a different kind of organization, and you had to prove your loyalty all the time. And he was promoted constantly. At the end of the war, he had the rank of major in the SS. We were never told this when he was brought over to run NASA. We were never told about a man called Sturkhold, who was the father of aviation medicine, who was moved to Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, a man who had conducted horrible experiments on human beings in the death camps. We brought over to run our aviation medicine operation. The list goes on and on. So at some point we decided that this was okay. The military thought that when rabbis objected, for instance, to the fact that so many Nazis were being brought over, documentation that's been declassified shows that the military was writing correspondence back and forth saying, well, they're Jewish. You know, they're emotional because of, you know, what they saw in the Holocaust and the death camps, so we shouldn't pay any attention to them. Obviously, their points of view are marred by personal feelings. I mean, this was the kind of reaction that was taking place every day. For President Nixon in 1947-48 to run against Helen Gahagan Douglas by using a whisper campaign that her husband was Jewish and getting traction for that, being able to destroy Helen Douglas as a candidate because of a rumor that her husband was Jewish, this is when the photographs of the death camps, the newsreels have been shown in every movie theater in the United States. This is astonishing that we could still get traction for anti-Semitism in the United States and that Nixon could run on a platform of anti-Semitism when he had fought in the war. You know, and he had been in the Navy in World War II. But as we find out later, as we can discuss at more length other times as I talk about in my books, Nixon, one of his first jobs after the war, when he was still in uniform, was going through captured Nazi documents in Washington, D.C. for a friend of his, Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles, who later became head of the CIA, who was at that time running part of the OSS in Europe, Allen Dulles helped him raise money for Nixon to run in California as a politician, something Nixon had not thought of until Dulles suggested it to him, and raised the money from oil interests to have Nixon run against Douglas. We find out later that Dulles had a lot to hide when it came to his involvement with Nazis and with his some of the remarks he made concerning the Nazi Party. Just like General Patton made a lot of remarks concerning the fact that he thought we had pointed our guns in the wrong direction when we fought the Nazis, when we should have been invading Russia instead. It was General Patton who put SS officers back in charge of camps of displaced persons. The same Jewish prisoners that were liberated by American forces now found themselves in camps being run by former SS guards who had run the camps before. I mean, all of this tone deafness when it comes to the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism was remarkable. And it was remarkable among Americans and among American military personnel who did not see the problem, who thought this was an exaggeration, that we shouldn't be led by these kinds of concepts. So all of this made me say, let me look further. Let me see who was involved, what was going on, what their beliefs were, what their ideologies were. We believe in the United States that we have a separation of church and state. Well, that's a legal separation. That's a legal term. It doesn't really work. Our political leaders have quite often been extremely religious. sometimes in bizarre ways. Ronald Reagan comes to mind as a person who believed in the literal apocalypse and the end of days. What a lot of people don't realize is that Ronald Reagan's religious denomination was called the Disciples of Christ. And that religious denomination, which was very end of days, very apocalyptic, was the same denomination to which Jim Jones belonged, the man who was responsible for the horrors of Jonestown in Guyana. They were co-religionists. These are people who believed in the same things. And the tremendous effect they've had on our political and cultural life is beyond comprehension right now. And that's just one instance. That's just one area. Because we believe there's a separation of church and state, we don't look that closely into our candidates' religious beliefs. We just want to know that they're not Muslim at this point. And this is part of our tone deafness when it comes to these issues. My belief is that we need to know sometimes what these people really do believe. If we have a political leader with his finger on the nuclear button who believes in the end of days and who believes that the second coming is imminent, if all we have to do is, build the third temple, for instance, in Jerusalem, and then Jesus will come back and save everyone, which is a belief that George W. Bush has. We need to know this because this is going to affect our relations with the rest of the world. It's going to affect American foreign policy. It's going to affect a lot of things, by putting people like this in power. So we need to know. In Germany, what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s was they had political leaders who were weird spiritually. They believed in occult powers. They believed in the purity of the race, which was not a genetic concept. It was a religious one. They believed that if you were spiritually pure, you were racially pure. These two things went hand in hand. In the blood was the spirit. In the blood was the power. That if you were an Aryan, pure-blooded Aryan, and if you slept with a person who was not Aryan, you became polluted. This is a very bizarre concept. It goes back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. It goes back to the Qumran sects, where there was the pure water, and you couldn't drink from the pure water until you yourself were pure. Otherwise, you would make all the water impure. This was the same concept the Nazis were using by saying, I'm pure. Our SS officers all are pure. They have to prove their racial purity, going back to the year 1750. But if one of them sleeps with a Jewish woman, then automatically he's rendered impure and he must be cast out from the SS, otherwise he'll pollute the rest of the SS. These concepts were very real to them. Why else would you have to prove your racial purity going back to 1750? Why else were the death camps kept running until the very end of the war, when it made no economic or military sense to do so? These are motivations that are not scientific. They're not rational in our sense of the word. These are occult motivations. And this is something that's fascinated me since the 1970s.
I was just about to get onto the occult. Most people are absolutely unaware of its predominance and influence in society and on the political situation, in fact, the whole world as it is today. I was wondering if you could go into that for a bit more.
Well, the occult is, the very word means secret. And we know that today we deal in a world that's comprised of secrets. We don't know all the secrets. We are paranoid. We are fearful of the fact that we don't know what's really going on. We see crises taking place constantly, and we're looking for scapegoats. When we don't find them, we start to imagine wild conspiracies. The problem is that, maybe half the time those wild conspiracies are true, or they have a basis in reality. Occultism is allied with the belief that there are secrets, and that if you have secret knowledge, you have secret power. What is, for instance, the CIA but a kind of secret society? A book came out in the 1970s called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, written by Marchetti and Marx, former CIA people. And it was a heavily redacted book. It was censored like crazy. But their thesis was that the CIA was essentially a cult, that intelligence itself was a cult. When I look at a secret society like the Freemasons, for instance, and I look at an intelligence operation like the Central Intelligence Agency or almost any intelligence agency, there are so many things they have in common. Number one, you have agents who have different names, right? They have false identities, as you do in many secret societies. You're given a separate name. You're given a separate communication system, secret handshakes, dead drops, safe houses. You're given places that are secret that no one else knows about. You believe as a secret agent that you have access to secrets in other countries, and these secrets give you power. This is the same as an occultist, the same as anyone working in the esoteric field, anyone working in a secret society. They believe they have tapped into forces of which average people are not aware. This is the same thing with an intelligence officer. The mentality is virtually the same. They know secrets, they have secret power, secret influence, secret identities. They are multilingual quite often, as many occultists are. They have to learn all sorts of languages. They have to become able to blend into the various parts of society. They don't advertise who they are. A secret agent is a spy, does not advertise that he's a spy, obviously. And neither do the best of the occultists advertise that they are occultists. They walk among the rest of us secretly. They keep their interests secret. They keep their practices secret. Secrecy is a cornerstone of occultism as it is for the intelligence agencies. A famous aphorism in occultism is to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. Those are the four recommendations or requirements for an occultist. So those are the same four recommendations you might find written on the floor of the CIA headquarters in Langley. Because on the floor of CIA headquarters in Langley, the phrase is, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Well, that's the first step, to know. And then there's to will. Of course, we've, not just the CIA, but intelligence agencies around the world, have been involved in overthrowing governments, have been taking their information that they collected and used it proactively to cause change in their environment, the way a magician causes change in his environment by summoning demonic forces or angelic forces, spiritual forces. That's to know and to will. To dare, of course, well, that goes beyond, without question. And to keep silent, they all do. Everyone keeps silent. The magician keeps silent about what he's done. He has to. In the old days, he could get burned at the stake for talking about it. And of course, the secret agent also keeps silent about what they've done. The secrets are important, and the silence is just as important as what they've accomplished. So, when we investigate political conspiracy, we are really in the same area as occult conspiracy. We are in the same neighborhood. And so many occultists, if you look at history, were also intelligence agents. Look at the Golden Dawn, the British Golden Dawn, for instance, very famous occult secret society. MacGregor Mathers, who was one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, wrote books on military theory and tactics, some of which are still in print and still used. Aleister Crowley, famous heir of the Golden Dawn system, was himself proved to be a secret agent working for British intelligence during World War II. In fact, Ian Fleming and Dennis Wheatley were friends of Aleister Crowley. Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels, considered using Aleister Crowley's expertise in occultism to combat the Nazis by creating false horoscopes and trying to figure out what the Nazi astrologers were telling Nazi leadership, for instance. Using Aleister Crowley's connections among German secret societies to use them as networks of spies and safe houses. This idea of occultists as intelligence agents goes back for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, but is still today, I mean, as late as World War II, we know of for sure, with people like Crowley and with Mathers, with one of the other leaders of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, a German secret society, who was thrown into the camps by the Gestapo for intelligence reasons. I mean, we have the examples that exist till today. We know that these two worlds overlap considerably because the mentality is quite the same. So once you start from that premise and you open your mind to that concept, you can start reading the newspapers in a different way. You can start building up your own database of individuals, people whose names keep coming up, operations that don't seem to make sense at first, and only make sense in retrospect and hindsight because it was really a secret operation. There were other forces at work. Once you start developing that kind of sensitivity, you'll be surprised at how different the world looks. And you don't have to be paranoid to do this. You just have to be alert, I think. There was a famous New York Times literary critic, Anatole Broyard, who once wrote that paranoids are the only ones who notice anything anymore. And that's one of my touchstones, one of my favorite sayings. You have to be a little paranoid, maybe, in order to notice what's really going on, to pay attention as part of being paranoid, I suppose.
Talk a little bit about which direction you go with the information you communicate. It's such a broad spectrum. Obviously, you're trying to bring something into public awareness because, like all of us, we really are about making people aware of what's really going on. What is the focus? What is the general direction you tend to go with when you try to bring people into this information, not only for the first time, but to sort of string it all together?
I think that it's important for people, in the first place, to become aware of this, not to buy into the news programs they've been watching for the last 30 or 40 years or so. We know that, for instance, television news has been co-opted to the point where it's just entertainment. Entertainment dollars drive news broadcasting. And right now in the United States, for instance, most of the news organs, from television to radio to magazines, print media, publishing companies, are owned by 5 companies. Only 5 companies own most of what we see in the United States in terms of media, in terms of news and other programming. That means that you could put 5 guys around a table at the Four Seasons or at the Jock of the 21 Club in New York, and they could sit there and pretty much dictate what Americans will learn, what they will see, what they will hear, what they will know. They're the ones who are going to control that to a large extent. I think that what we need to do is we need to be aware of that, first of all, that we cannot rely upon the news media to tell us everything. They're going to tell us little bits and pieces. They're going to keep us entertained. We're going to look at the news the way we're looking at a reality TV show, and that's the extent of our involvement. The world's become a very dangerous place. The world's become a very complicated place. We can't, on our own, as individuals, hope to counteract all the effects of what's taking place behind the scenes, because we have no idea what that is. We don't have the political power or the economic power. But as individuals, we can become aware of what's really going on. We can become aware of history. We can become aware of the currents that are running through, how we're being manipulated, how our fears are being manipulated to make us march in lockstep behind leaders who are using fear as a propaganda device to make sure that they have additional power, that they can extend their power over us. We have to, I think, liberate ourselves on a one-by-one basis. Each of us individually has to liberate our consciousness and do what we can to do that, to free ourselves of this stranglehold that media has on us, because we have been led down the garden path so many times. In Germany, in 1933, we had Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany under impossible conditions. I mean, if you want to believe that Hitler came to power through regular political machinations, you'll have to look again. Because in 1932, in December, he had no power. His party had lost so many seats in the German parliament, it wasn't funny. By January of 1933, he suddenly was Chancellor of Germany. And this was due to circumstances I talk about in the Holy Alliance, but basically there was an occult operation designed to put him back in power. He got in power, and then there was the Reichstag fire. There was a fire of the German parliament building, and Hitler immediately blamed it on communists and told the German people to give him power over them, to give him complete power in Germany, to become the Führer, and then he would guarantee their safety. This is a technique that's been used again and again and again in countries around the world before and since. And it happened in the United States after 9/11. We had a president who said, give me all the power, give me the Patriot Act, give me Homeland Security, I'll make sure you're safe, but you're going to lose some liberties here and there. You're going to lose privacy, you're going to lose habeas corpus, you're going to lose a number of things. We're going to break a lot of laws, but we're doing this to keep you safe. As long as we believe in that premise, as long as we believe it's more important to be safe than to be right, it's more important to be safe than it is to be free, we're going to get the kind of leadership we deserve. What we have to do is fight the fear. This is the first thing that we have to do. We have to fight the fear. We have to stop being afraid. I heard so many times since 9/11 that 9/11 changed the world. Nonsense. It didn't change the world. You know, all it changed was the United States became part of the world in 9/11. But the rest of the world's been living with terrorism for decades, for longer than decades, for centuries. It's been a commonplace. Ask anyone in Northern Ireland. Ask anyone in the Middle East, as an example. In Europe, anywhere in Europe, where there have been bombings in train stations and discotheques and everything else. By right-wing extremists, by the way, not necessarily by left-wing extremists. So you have a history of this that goes on forever. Nothing changed. Okay, what changed is the Americans should have had a wake-up call, and instead they did predictably what they would do. What I knew they would do is they would fear, and using by being afraid, they would give their political leaders ultimate power to quote-unquote protect them. And that's what's been going on now. We have to individually free ourselves. I mean, there's no way to do it otherwise, I don't think. If we form organizations to do it, there's going to be power politics, there's going to be leaders, they're going to be charismatic, and we're going to eventually sign over part of our souls to them. So I think it starts with us. If we're free individually, then no one can enslave us collectively. And I think that's what we have to do.
That's a very good answer. I love that. Freedom Central is about providing a platform for people who, like yourself, who have a message for humanity. What would your message be?
Things are not as bad as they appear. Things are made to look bad, obviously, because that's how people stay in power. No one stays in power when things are great. I mean, there's no way to extend power under those circumstances. You need fear, you need an enemy. When the Berlin Wall came down and when the Soviet Union fell, so many people told me, oh, that's it. We don't need armies anymore. You know, the war is over. All of this is over. We're going to be free and happy. And I thought to myself, hardly. You know, I know there's more scapegoats out there just waiting. And of course there was. It was Saddam Hussein at that point. And then the whole idea of Arab terrorism became a big issue. It's hardly a big issue in the real world, but it is a big issue on television. So I guess my message is we have to fight the fear. We have to realize that things are not as bad as they seem, that we're being told things are very bad. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once we believe that things are bad, we make them worse. I think what we have to do is stop this wheel of karma from turning. We have to say to ourselves, okay, we're getting off at this stop. You know, we're going to insist that the world is really a lot better than we've made it out to be. And this insistence, this will that we have to develop is very important. Otherwise, what we've done is we've just surrendered our individuality, our hopes, our dreams. We've surrendered them all to the fear. We've surrendered it all to people who are going to tell us that they're going to protect us, whether it's economically, politically, militarily, whatever, in whatever manner. No one's going to do that for you. You have to do that yourself. This is your own responsibility. And I know that's easy to say. If you're living in Darfur right now, that's easy to say. You don't want Joseph Campbell coming along in Darfur and saying, follow your bliss. In Darfur, that's not going to happen. So you need political activism. I'm not denying that. You need people to get together and say, this has got to stop. But it starts with you. It starts internally. It starts with each one of us on our own. And then we find like-minded people and we go forward from there.
To give it back to me. They say, okay, what did you see? How many guns? How were they armed? They were more curious about what I had seen than they were about me. I answered them as best as I could. The bus arrived. I got on my bus going back to Santiago. And on the way back, the bus had stopped several times at roadblocks. Chilean army personnel, soldiers, walked onto the bus and asked for me by name. All the way back to Santiago. In 79. When I get back to my hotel room, there's a note waiting for me telling me what flight I'm on the next day. I'm on a flight to Miami. I wasn't going to Miami, but I took the flight. All of this was fine up to a point. Of course, I'm getting very nauseous. I mean, during the whole time I was perfectly cool, no fear, no problem. But I'm on the plane flying back to Miami, and I'm starting to get really ill over this thing. I'm thinking, what the hell did I do? What did I escape from? I get back into Miami, I go through immigration and customs, and there's two gentlemen waiting for me. Gentlemen from the United States government. They flash badges and they say, are you Levenda? Where have I heard that before? But they had better accents. So they ask to see my passport, they see it, they smile, they walk away. So what the hell is going on, right? So I go and I sit down, I buy a copy of the Miami Herald, I open it up, and you can check this out. It was on July 2nd, I think, of 1979. The German parliament had just voted to extend the statute of limitations on Nazi war crimes, to extend the statute of limitations for murder. I didn't know this vote was taking place. In those days, no Google. So I didn't know what was going on. Suddenly it became clear to me. They thought I was some kind of agent provocateur. They thought I was somebody who was there trying to provoke a reaction that they would have to deal with. That's the only reason I got out of there alive. And I'm not trying to exaggerate this. This is something that we all face as researchers in this field. We come across things that are very strange and very dangerous. But the reason I know I was very lucky was because 2 years later, a man called Boris Weisweiler, who was a professor at MIT, was hiking in Chile, maybe 10, 15 kilometers from Colonia Dignidad. But the Chilean security forces found him hiking innocently. This was still under Pinochet, as you may remember. They picked him up and took him to the colony. They took him to Colonia Dignidad. He has never been heard from since. His family has been looking for him, petitioning the U.S. government, petitioning the Chilean government, ever since then, since 1982, roughly, until now. They don't know what happened to him. Photographs of Boris Weisweiler that I found look kind of like me. We're both Eastern European background. We both had beards and glasses. It's possible they mistook him for me. And then when they realized their mistake, they couldn't let him go. Because after I came back from the States, there were news reports about the colony in Jack Anderson's column and places like that. They may have assumed that I had blurted something out. Believe me, I was trying desperately to tell the story, but nobody wanted to hear it at the time. So, yes, it was a dangerous place. It was finally raided once Pinochet left power. And when I say raided, I don't mean a couple of cops and a subpoena. They came in with the National Guard, with the military, with helicopters, half-tracks, tanks, because it was a formidable place to try to enter surreptitiously, as I found out. And they found out that the leader had disappeared. They began to look around and they found underground torture chambers that they had used to torture political prisoners during the Pinochet regime. They did it by remote control. This was a weird thing, sort of out of a science fiction novel. They had people strapped to iron beds, and the iron beds... I got the signal. So the iron beds were connected to electrical systems, and the remote control guy would sit there in his booth, and he would turn on...
Is there anything else you'd like to contribute?
Read. I don't necessarily mean read my books, of course I do, but read. Turn off the tube once in a while. Turn off mainstream media once in a while. Look for alternate sources of information. Don't trust everything you see. You should not trust alternate sources of information just as you should not trust mainstream sources of information. What you have to do is make up your own minds. You have to do the research. A little bit. If you spend 2 or 3 hours a day in front of television, as many of you do, and you decide to use those 2 or 3 hours to do some research on your own, you'll be surprised at how enriched you become and how much of a font of information you will become. This is what you have to do. Read, learn. The information is there. It's out there. What's happening is no one is paying attention, And our governments and our media people are all comfortable knowing that we really don't want to know. We don't want to take the effort, and reading is just too hard. Make the effort. You'll be surprised. With just 1 week or 2 weeks of making that effort, you're going to see your world start to change and your perspective start to change. And that's going to be a healthy thing.
Peter Levenda, it's been an honor and a privilege to have your time today. Thank you ever so much.
Pleasure is mine. Anytime.